Welcome to World History. Today we're going to pick up our story by moving slightly northward and continuing to explain how the events of the French Revolution kicked off revolutionary movements in Latin America. This time, instead of focusing on Bolivar in South America, we're going to move up north to talk about the revolutionary movement in New Spain, or what is today called Mexico. So, hopefully, you remember the major things from Latin America, because we're going to see some of the themes repeating here. So, hopefully, you'll be able to explain how the situation in Mexico was in some ways similar and in some ways different from Latin America. Then we'll look at the way that the Army of the Three Guarantees brought together various Mexican factions. We're going to explain the forces that brought Porfirio Diaz to power. And then we're going to look at the Porfiriato and to discuss whether or not we think it was an effective government for Mexico. So, pros and cons. Of course, as you remember from last time, there was a colonial class structure. The whiter you are, the more powerful you were and the more rights you had. And of course, the reforms after the American Revolution cobbled on this whole peninsulare thing, which alienated the few people who were not already alienated by the system. So all of that stuff is the same. The thing about Mexico is the indigenous population was even larger than it was in South America. And so they're going to play an even larger role here in Mexican independence than they did in Latin American independence. But at the same time, the Creoles, the people who were white of Spanish blood but born in the Americas, are still going to be the leaders of this movement. And so we're going to see some major similarities and differences between these two groups. Another thing to be noted is that although Native Americans suffered in all regions, in Mexico, the conditions of the Native Americans were especially bad, and so they were even more primed than the remnants of the Inca Empire in Peru to rise up and be part of this revolutionary movement. And so, trying to get better treatment for Native Americans is going to be much more a part of this revolution than it was in the Latin American revolutions, where it's mostly fights between Creoles versus Creoles about trying to figure out who's going to be in charge. And this is really because of the economy of Mexico. The economy of Mexico was based almost entirely about silver extraction, specifically silver extraction from the massive silver mines at Zacatecas. This was also the case in Peru, where again the Native Americans were much more likely to revolt. But Peru was, as you remember, not the center of independence movements, whereas New Spain is going to have this massive independence movement with all these Native Americans who are horribly oppressed. So the conditions in the mines were absolutely terrible, but for the revolutionaries, they hoped that all of this silver would provide a sort of stable economic base once they got their independence. So the independence kicks off with what's called the Grito de Dolores. This was an independence movement led by a guy named Father Miguel Hidalgo, who was a white Creole, but because he was a priest, he had connections with the native people, and he had been advocating for them for a number of years. He, along with a bunch of the other Creoles, had been planning this uprising for some time because, of course, of the oppressive trade practices and the racist casta system that had been imposed by the Spanish. And so, when the abdications of Bayonne hit, when the Spanish government was overthrown, they kicked off this independence movement, and Father Miguel Hidalgo issued this cry to the native peoples to free themselves, recover the land stolen by the Spaniards, defend your religion and rights, and overthrow the Peninsulares. He was able to use this to raise a massive army of mostly mixed race and Native American soldiers and captured all the territory that you see on this map. Unfortunately for Padre Miguel Hidalgo, his movement never actually took the capital. And when his army, after defeating the army of the Spanish royalists, had a chance to march on the capital, Miguel Hidalgo sort of funneled them away from the capital and decided not to take it. And historians have questioned why this was for many years. The general consensus is he was worried that things would get out of hand and it would get very massacre-y and very genocidal if he took the capital. But the problem for Hidalgo is once he didn't take the capital, the movement sort of petered out as most of these lower class and poor mixed race and Native Americans had to go back home to work on their farms and feed their families. And so the end result is he has this super inspirational movement, but his army melts away. He himself is captured and shot in the back. And so movement starts to collapse. But a guy named Jose Maria Morelos, who was a mixed race mestizo, picks up this movement and continues the fight. He's a relatively effective general. He raises the cause of more rights for the mestizos and protections for Native Americans, and he's able to sort of cobble Hidalgo's movement back together. He's fighting against a guy named Agustin Iturbide, who is the main representative of Spain. He's a royalist who believed in divine right of kings. And these two guys are going to face off for the middle phase of the War for Independence. Morelos is relatively successful, adding all of the territory again you see on this map. But unfortunately, Agustin Iturbide, known as the Iron Dragon, is a relatively effective general, and he's able to capture Morelos and kill him. So Morelos executed. The banner is picked up by the Afro-Mexican general, Guerrero, Vicente Guerrero, and so he becomes the revolutionary leader. But with Morelos gone, all of the momentum starts to fade from the movement, and Guerrero goes from controlling tons of territory to basically fighting a guerrilla campaign in the mountains. And so for Guerrero, he is the one guy who's holding on to this banner, but the movement is very clearly falling apart. And then the mutiny at Cadiz happens. As we remember, Spain raised a massive army to try to go fight and recapture the Americas, and then that army turned on the Spanish government and forced the king to accept a new constitution. And so, just like the revolutionaries in Latin America started to realize that the fight was over once no more reinforcements once no more reinforcements were coming, Agustin Iturbide realizes the same thing. He now decides that he's on the losing side, and he unites together with Guerrero to form what's called the Army of the Three Guarantees, a union between royalists and revolutionaries. And they issue these three guarantees in what's known as the Plan of Iguala, which provides for independence, equality for at least white people, and Catholicism as the future religion. This does not accomplish, of course, Guerrero's goal of equality for non-white Mexicans, but at this point, he's looking for any way to get independence that he can, and he's hoping that down the road, he can force some of these better reforms. So the two embrace here, as we see, the union between Agustin Iturbide and Vicente Guerrero, and together they march on Mexico City, seize control of the capital, and Mexico is free. But as we clearly talked about before, this doesn't solve any of the problems of, one, equality for Native Americans and mixed race people, and the question of should the central government have a lot of power or should the local states have a lot of power? Because the same centralist federalist divide that dominated Latin American politics also dominates Mexican American politics. And so the early history of Mexico is you get presidents who overthrow presidents, who go into exile, who then raise armies and come back and overthrow presidents. So, for example, Agustin Iturbide declares himself Emperor of Mexico, and Mexico becomes a short-lived empire before Vicente Guerrero raises an army and overthrows him. Guerrero is then overthrown by someone else, who's overthrown by someone else. And the guy who most represents this caudillo-style overthrowing of governments is a guy named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Santa Anna was was president of Mexico 11 different times, and he never finished out a term. In fact, in the first 20 years of Mexican history, there were approximately 49 different changes of the presidency. And if you're constantly getting overthrown and having to go into exile, it's very difficult to run an effective government. This is one of the problems with military rule is that if you have the power, if you seize power, you have to be able to hold power and project it outward. But of course, if your other generals or other people become more powerful, they're able to come in, suspend the Constitution, and overthrow the government. The other problem Mexico has, in the words of future dictator/president Porfirio Diaz, is poor Mexico. So far from God, so close to the United States. This is the time period of manifest destiny, and so a group of Americans move into the northern Mexican province of Tejas, declare independence, and a debate over the border leads to war with the United States. The United States decisively wins this war, defeating the Mexican army several times, taking Mexico City itself, and Mexican President Santa Anna is defeated so soundly that the US Army actually captures his wooden leg, and we currently have it in a museum in Indiana. The US forces the Mexican government to then cede a bunch of territory in the South, basically all of California and the lower South and the Southwest, in what's known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the Mexican government is significantly diminished. Then, in the 1860s, Mexico is invaded by France. This is under the reign of Napoleon III, a guy we're going to introduce tomorrow. So France then invades Mexico, takes over, overthrows the government, and installs a new leader, the Emperor Maximilian, who's an Austrian prince. Maximilian's government falls apart, but it again represents the instability and weakness of the new Mexican state and their inability to really establish a long administration or an effective administration that can get things done. Obviously, Maximilian once he is overthrown, he's executed, and Mexican government falls back to Mexicans, specifically a guy named Benito Juarez. Juarez issues in an era called La Reforma, where he's going to try to modernize the Mexican state. He's going to bring in new agricultural techniques. He's going to try to bring in foreign investment. And he's going to basically try to economically and socially improve Mexico. His plan works for a few years, but as Juarez prepares to run for a second term, many within the Mexican government start to worry that he's going to be a dictator and he's never going to give up power. And so the call of no re-election leads to the overthrow of Juarez and the rise of a new Mexican force, a former army general known as Porfirio Diaz, who we see pictured here on the right. Diaz then goes on to be the president of Mexico on and off for the next 40 years, either becoming president or having one of his underlings become president, and eventually he rewrites the Mexican Constitution so he can be reelected in perpetuity. And so from about 1870 to 1912, Porfirio Diaz becomes president of Mexico. While he's president, he issues a platform, he runs an informal policy known as Pan o Palo, where on the one hand, you get massive modernization. You bring in foreign investment. They build railroads. They build modern industry. And he rewards his supporters with these positions. That is the pan, or bread, of this policy. On the other side, if you go against Porfirio Diaz, if you try to run against him in an election, say, or you turn down these gifts of bread, you get the palo, or the stick. Namely, the Mexican army comes in and roughs you up. And so Porfirio Diaz becomes the unchallenged dictator of Mexico. Mexico does modernize, but most of this foreign investment benefits upper-class Mexicans, and very little of it benefits the Native Americans and the mixed-race population that originally started this revolution in the first place. So the questions are, to what extent was this revolution successful? To what extent was the Porfiriato, the stability of the Porfiriato, necessary, versus to what extent did it destroy these ideals? So hopefully you can answer these questions as we now move. For tomorrow, we're going to move over to Europe and look at the aftermath of the French Revolution over there.